Hey Daily Dosers, my name is Chris Hilken. Today we're on day 3 of evidence for God's existence. So today we talked the first day about why is there something rather than nothing. Yesterday we talked about because there is something rather than nothing and that something had an original beginning, that something must have a cause or a causal agent that made it. And if that causal agent is bigger than the universe, that's kind of what we all mean when we say the idea of God, but it also points to you and me. That if we are contingent beings and everything that begins to exist has a purpose, you and I began to exist, which means we've got a purpose that we're supposed to be searching and looking for that's bigger than us. And it's grounded in who made us. Today we're talking about this idea of when we look around the universe, there seems to be complexity everywhere. And the argument is really simple. I was up at Hume Lake with my son a couple summers back, and we were walking up this trail, and someone had carved their initials into a tree with a heart around it. And that level of complexity, my son Peyton said, who drew that? And now you might say, well, you've brainwashed your kid to see design, to see patterns everywhere. But my son, who was 4 years old at the time, looked at something as simple as a carved heart and 2 letters and said, who was here? You see, that's as simple as it is for us to necessitate a who. You notice my son didn't say what made this or what kind of a hurricane must it have taken or what kind of a tornado. My son jumped immediately to who. So you're at a cabin in the woods, right? All by yourself. Your friends never showed up when they were supposed to. It's a dark and spooky night. You're eating alphabet cereal. You accidentally spill the box. You go to clean it up. And when you come back to bring the vacuum, it says, I wouldn't go to bed if I were you, spelled out in alphabet cereal. Would any of us go, there's a chance that the box spilled over that way? Not reasonably. We would all freak out. I would call the police and run, and there'd be a lot of other things involved in that process. Why? Because when we see something as simple as that, we automatically jump to who. Now, there's actually a guy named Francis Collins. He mapped out the human genome, and the human genome is basically, think about the Encyclopedia Britannica. And in one simple strand of DNA, you can fill about 30 million volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica in just the human body. But if you grabbed a bunch of letters and a bunch of paper and a bunch of binding, you threw them in a room, no matter how much time you gave them, no matter how much no matter how many times you shocked them with whatever chemicals you would never get even a coherent sentence. Nevertheless, the Encyclopedia Britannica. And in your cells and in your genome is a set of letters, ATs, Gs, and Cs that are the absolute copycat directions to make more of your personal cells. And so the same argument would be if something as simple as don't go to bed tonight or C plus L equals love on that tree at Hume Lake, if we look at all that and say that must be a who, and then you look at the complexity of the DNA sequence or the complexity of subatomic particles or microorganisms, when you look at those things that have coding and lettering inside of them as well, more complex than any computer could ever have. There's more neurological connections electrically moving in your brain than the whole county of Los Angeles combined. And then to look at all that and say, no, I'm going to look for a natural explanation for this outside of intelligence, outside of a divine being. It seems to me that there's got to be a bias ahead of time, and I think a lot of people would agree with that. Einstein even said this. He said, everyone who is seriously involved in the pursuit of science becomes convinced at some point that some kind of a spirit is manifest in the laws of the universe. In this way, the pursuit of science leads to a religious feeling of a special sort. There's another guy. He's a Harvard evolutionary geneticist. His name is Richard Lewontin. And he says, our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. He's going to help explain, well, if this is so obvious, why don't we just accept it in science? He says, because we have to take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill all the things that it's promised, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated, that means unproven, just so stories, because we've made a commitment ahead of time, a commitment to materialism. So he says, here's the reason that we can't have a supernatural explanation, because we decided in science, there's no room for it. We didn't actually do all of the homework it takes to arrive at that. We decided before we ever opened our textbook, there is no God. Then of course, when you dig up fossils and you look at the genome and you look at these numbers and letters and sequences and design, of course you're not going to find it. You have canceled it out a priori. A priori means before I even started looking at it, I already decided my conclusion. I think when you don't, God's voice screams all over the complexity of nature. And if it's that simple for us to beg for a who, you are so much more complicated than that. And that's the third evidence for God's existence.